The night had teeth. It sank them into the land, into the brittle grass and the hollow wind that moaned across the valley. The ranch sat at the edge of that darkness, like a flickering lantern in a storm, fragile and small, and inside its walls, a man sat awake, long after the fire had died. His name was Elias Crow, though most folks simply called him Crow, and his eyes were as restless as the prairie wolves that prowled just beyond the fence line. Crow had lived his life by the rules of hard soil and harder men. A rancher's work left no room for illusions. Cattle got sick, fences broke, men drew guns when words failed. And yet tonight, as he listened to the sound of a child crying in the next room, he felt the earth shift beneath him. It was not the cry of his blood, but it had become the cry of his conscience. The girl's name was Anaba. She was no more than 8, thin as a shadow, her black hair tangled and wild from weeks of running. Crow had found her near the riverbank 2 nights ago, half-starved, her feet torn raw from stones. She had clutched a broken doll against her chest, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, had fixed on him like she was staring at a ghost. He didn't ask how she got there, he just carried her home. Now he understood why she had been running. Because tonight, they came for her. The sound reached him first. The low thunder of hooves rolling across the valley floor, steady as a war drum. Crow rose to his feet, moving to the window, his hand brushing the rifle leaning by the sill. The moonlight revealed dark figures gathering beyond the fencemen on horseback, their silhouettes crowned with feathers, their presence as unyielding as the mountain itself. The Apache. Crow had known it was only a matter of time. He had taken in one of theirs, whether by accident or fate, and blood always called to blood. But as he stepped onto the porch, the air thick with dust and silence, he realized this was no ordinary gathering. There were dozens of riders, perhaps more, and they carried not only weapons but judgment in their eyes. One figure dismounted, stepping forward with deliberate calm. He was tall, with braids that gleamed like black rope in the starlight, his chest marked with scars that told stories Crow would never know. His gaze fell on the rancher, sharp as flint. "You have our child," the warrior said in broken English, each word heavy with restrained fury. "She belongs to us." Crow's throat tightened, but his voice remained steady. "She's here, safe. She came to me starving. I gave her bread, water. She's a child." The warrior's eyes narrowed. "You took her." "She found me," Crow replied. "If you believe otherwise, then it's a lie whispered by fear. I didn't steal her, but I won't hand her over to men who ride in the night like hunters chasing prey." "Tell me, what does she run from?" The warrior's jaw flexed, his silence louder than any answer. Behind him, the other riders shifted, their horses snorting clouds into the night. The girl's sobs carried faintly through the cabin walls, and for the first time, Crow felt the sharp edge of impossibility. This was not a matter of law. This was a matter of worlds colliding, of trust shattered long before he stepped into it. "Your blood is not hers," the warrior said at last. "You cannot keep her." Crow's fingers brushed the brim of his hat, his voice low, almost weary. "Then take me instead." The words hung between them, raw and reckless. Even Crow felt their weight crush against his chest, but he did not pull them back. He saw the girl's terrified eyes in his memory, saw the hollowness of her cheeks, and he knew there was no other way. "You want a life in return?" Crow continued. "You want a price for the trespass you believe I've made? Then I offer mine. But the child stays free." A murmur rippled through the gathered riders, disbelief and anger mixing like sparks in dry grass. The warrior's face betrayed nothing, but his eyes darkened. He stepped closer, so close Crow could see the lines carved deep into his weathered skin. "You would trade yourself," he said slowly, "for one not of your blood?" Crow met his gaze without flinching. "Blood doesn't matter when the choice is between chains and freedom. She deserves the chance to live without fear. I've lived long enough with mine." For a long, terrible moment, there was only the sound of horses shifting and the wind dragging through the grass. Then the warrior raised his hand, and the riders stilled. "You will come," he said. At dawn, alone, the child stays. Crow inclined his head, a grim acceptance etched in the gesture. He did not look back as he re-entered the cabin, but the weight of the night pressed against his shoulders like a mountain. Inside, Annabeth sat on the edge of the bed, her doll clutched in trembling hands. Her dark eyes searched his face, and though she did not understand the words that had been spoken outside, she understood enough. "You promised," she whispered. Crow knelt before her, his voice steady though his heart was breaking. "I promise to keep you safe, and I will. Tomorrow the sun will rise, and you'll be free." Her small hands reached for his, desperate and pleading. "But you won't." He couldn't lie to her. Not now. He simply drew her into his arms, holding her as the night stretched on, as if the strength of his embrace could shield her from what dawn would demand. By the time the first light bled across the horizon, Elias Crow had saddled his horse and prepared himself for the journey. The girl clung to Mrs. Crane, the elderly neighbor who had come at first light, her weathered face grim with unspoken protest. "You're a damn fool," she whispered harshly as Crow tightened his saddle strap. "These aren't men you bargain with. You won't come back." Crow looked past her, to where Annabeth stood in the doorway, her eyes swollen from crying. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but she will." And with that, he rode out toward the waiting riders, each hoofbeat a toll of sacrifice, each breath a prayer unspoken. The land seemed to hold its breath as he approached, the tribe's warriors parting to let him pass. The tall warrior stood at their center, his expression unreadable. Crow dismounted, handing over the reins without hesitation. "I am here," he said. "The child is yours no longer. My life is the payment you seek." The warrior studied him for a long, heavy silence, then nodded once. "Then so it shall be." And with those words, Elias Crow stepped into a fate from which there would be no turning back. The ride into the canyon felt like a funeral march. The warriors rode in silence, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed forward as if unwilling to acknowledge the man who had offered himself into their hands. Elias Crow rode without bindings, but the absence of ropes was not mercy. It was certainty. He could no more escape these riders than he could escape the grave. The canyon swallowed them whole, its red walls rising like the ribs of a giant beast, shadows clinging to every crevice. Fires glowed in the distance, their smoke spiraling into the pale dawn sky. This was not a raiding party, not a band of outcasts. This was the heart of a people, and Crow felt the weight of their history pressing down on him as the riders dismounted. Children peered from behind their mothers, eyes wide at the sight of the stranger who had walked into their circle. Old men leaned on staffs carved with the marks of ancestors. The air was thick with suspicion, with anger, with something deeper wounded pride. The tall warrior who had spoken at the ranch raised his hand, and the crowd stilled. His voice rang clear. "This man has taken one of our children. He offers himself in her place. But his words are not enough. He will speak before the council, and we will decide if his life is worth the trade." A murmur rippled through the crowd, low and dangerous. Crow stood straight, his hands at his sides, his eyes scanning faces that burned with centuries of mistrust. He knew what they saw. A rancher, a settler, a man whose kind had pushed their people to the edges of hunger and despair. His single act of mercy could not erase the bloodlines of history. He was led to the fire at the canyon's center, where the council sat in a circle. Their hair was streaked with gray, their faces weathered by sun and storm. The tall warrior took his place among them, but it was an older man, his eyes clouded yet sharp with wisdom, who spoke first. "You bring us a riddle, stranger. You say you did not steal the child, and yet she was found in your care. You offer your life, though you owe us nothing. Tell us what kind of man gives himself up for one who is not his kin." Crow drew a slow breath, the firelight etching shadows across his face. "The kind of man who knows what it is to be left with nothing. I've buried a wife. I've buried a son. I know the sound a child makes when the world has turned its back on her. That's the sound I heard when she cried in her sleep, and I couldn't turn away. The council exchanged glances, some skeptical, some softened by the rawness of his words. But the tall warrior's voice cut through. "Words are wind. Will you prove them?" "How?" Crow asked. The warrior's eyes gleamed like obsidian. "By enduring what we endure. By walking where our feet have bled. If you survive the trial, perhaps your life will not be wasted. If you fail, the earth will take you, and the child's freedom will be sealed in your grave." The trial began at once. They led Crow into the canyon's depths, where the sun carved jagged shadows and the air was dry enough to crack skin. His first task was to carry water from the river, a journey that took hours under the unrelenting heat. The clay jar dug into his shoulders, its weight multiplied by the eyes that watched every step. By the time he staggered back, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and his breath rasped like sandpaper. But he did not fall. Next came the climb. A sheer wall of stone rose before him, jagged and merciless. The warriors scaled it like mountain cats, their limbs guided by instinct and memory. Crow's hands bled as he clawed at the rock, his muscles screaming with each pull. Twice he nearly slipped, the abyss yawning below, but the thought of Inaba's terrified face burned in his mind like a brand. Inch by inch he climbed. When he reached the top, his body shook with exhaustion, but he stood tall. The final trial came with nightfall. They placed him at the edge of the fire circle, a spear thrust into his hand. Across from him stood a warrior younger than the rest, his eyes fierce with challenge. "This is not to the death," the tall warrior said, "but you must stand. Show us the strength you claim is hers to inherit." The clash was brutal. The young warrior moved like lightning, his strikes sharp and unrelenting. Crow was slower, his body battered by the day's ordeals, but he fought with the stubborn resilience of a man who had weathered storms no one else had seen. The spear splintered, blood spilled, and in the end, it was Crow who stood, bruised and staggering, but unbroken. The council watched in silence. The younger warrior bowed his head, not in defeat, but in respect. And for the first time, the murmurs in the crowd shifted, still wary, still weighted with anger, but touched by something new. When the fire died low, the elder spoke again. "You have walked where our feet bleed. You have climbed where our hands are torn. You have fought with courage, though your body is failing. We cannot yet call you brother, but neither can we call you enemy." The tall warrior stepped forward, his face unreadable. "At dawn, the council will decide your fate. Until then, you will remain here. Watch the stars, rancher. They may be the last you see." Crow sat alone by the dying fire, every muscle aching, every wound throbbing. The stars burned cold above him, scattered across the endless sky, and for the first time in years, he felt the presence of his wife beside him, her voice carried in the whisper of the wind. "You did what you had to," she seemed to say, "and tomorrow, whatever comes, she will live." Sleep took him like a thief, sudden and merciful. But when dawn came and the council gathered once more, Crow saw something he had not expected. Inaba was there. The child had slipped into the canyon with Mrs. Crane at her side. Defying fear, defying distance, she ran to him, throwing her thin arms around his neck, sobbing into his shirt. The crowd gasped, and even the tall warrior's stern face cracked with surprise. "She came to us in chains," the elder murmured, "but she returns to him in freedom. This is no thief. This is no enemy. This is a man who offered himself for a child who was nothing to him. Tell me how many among us would do the same." Silence spread like a wave, heavy and undeniable. And in that silence, the first seed of change was sown. The sun rose like a blade drawn across the horizon, slicing the shadows from the canyon floor. Its light fell upon faces gathered in silence, faces etched with lines of grief, anger, and something else taking shape: curiosity, perhaps, or a reluctant respect. Elias Crow stood among them, his body battered, his shirt torn, but his eyes steady. He had been broken before. Today, he was unbreakable. The council gathered around the fire once more. The elder leaned on his staff, his voice carrying the weight of generations. This man offered his life for a child not his own. He has walked our trials, bled on our stones, stood in our circle. His blood could yet water our anger, or it could water something new. Today, we choose. Crow waited for the judgment, his jaw set, his hands loose at his sides. He did not plead, he did not bow. Whatever they decided, he had kept his word to Anaba, and that alone gave him peace. But then, a sound split the stillness. A child's voice. Anaba stepped forward, her thin frame trembling, but her eyes fierce with a courage that startled even the warriors. She stood before the council, before the tribe, before the man who had been willing to die for her. Her small hands tightened around the broken doll she always carried. "He saved me," she said in her own tongue, her voice high and piercing. "He gave me food when I was hungry. He gave me water when I was dying. He gave me his home when I had none. He gave me his life so I could keep mine. He is not our enemy. He is the man who saw me as a person when others saw me as nothing." Her words rippled through the circle like fire catching dry grass. Mothers drew their children close. Fathers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Even the younger warriors, their faces hard with suspicion, felt something stir. The tall warrior, who had been the harshest judge, looked at her for a long moment before turning back to Crow. "Do you hear her words? She calls you more than a stranger. She calls you the man who gave when there was nothing to gain." "I didn't come here for honor," Crow said quietly. "I came here to keep her free. Whatever else you see in me is your choice, not mine." The elder raised his staff, and the crowd fell silent once more. His voice trembled but did not falter. "We have seen men of his kind bring fire to our land, hunger to our children, chains to our freedom. But this one," he turned his eyes on Crow, "this one has given himself instead of taking. And if we destroy such a man, then we destroy the very thing we have always demanded of others' respect." He struck the staff against the ground. "His life is spared." For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, slowly, impossibly, the warriors stepped back. Mothers lowered their heads. Fathers pressed fists to their chests. And one by one, the tribe bowed not in defeat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. They bowed to the rancher who had offered his life for a child. Crow's chest tightened, not with pride, but with a strange, humbling ache. He had expected death. He had expected rage. He had not expected this. The tall warrior stepped forward and clasped his arm in the way of equals. "Elias Crow," he said, speaking the name with deliberate weight. "Your land is no longer yours alone. From this day, our tribe defends it as our own. Any who come to harm you will find us in their path." The declaration echoed across the canyon, heavy as thunder. Crow swallowed hard, the enormity of it pressing down. "I never asked for defenders," he said softly. "No," the warrior replied. "And that is why you are worthy of them." Anaba slipped her hand into Crow's, her eyes shining with tears. For the first time since he had found her by the river, her shoulders eased, as though the weight of fear had lifted. She was safe. Not just because of him, but because an entire people had chosen to stand with her. That night, a feast was prepared in the canyon. Fires roared high, drums echoed against the stone walls, and for the first time in years, laughter cracked the silence. Children played near the flames, their voices sharp with joy. Crow sat among them, his wounds bound, his spirit heavier than it had ever been, and yet strangely light. Mrs. Crane sat beside him, her old eyes glistening. "You're a damn fool," she muttered again, but this time her voice broke with affection. "A damn fool who's still breathing." Crow managed a weary smile. "Guess fools have their uses." Anaba leaned against his side, her doll tucked under her arm, her eyes finally closing in sleep. He looked down at her, then out across the tribe that had once ridden to take her away and now gathered to guard her. Something deep in him shifted something that had been locked since the graves of his wife and son. He had lost a family once, but tonight he found one again. The dawn of the next morning brought no war drums, no threats, only the quiet strength of unity. As the sun climbed the canyon walls, the warriors stood at the ridge, watching over his ranch in the distance, their presence a silent vow. For Elias Crow, the cost had been everything he thought he still had to lose. But the reward was a truth no death could bury. Sacrifice can change not just a life, but the hearts of many. And in that moment, with the whole tribe bowing not to him, but to what he represented, he understood that sometimes the greatest power lies not in taking, but in giving everything. Stories like Elias Crow's remind us that real strength isn't measured in bullets, fences, or titles. It's measured in the sacrifices we make for others, even when the cost feels unbearable. He stood alone against a world that should have crushed him, and instead of breaking, he lit a fire that changed hearts. If his story moved you, if it made you think about what it truly means to protect, to give, and to stand firm even in the face of despair, then share it. Let others feel the weight of his choice, and maybe, just maybe, carry that lesson into their own lives. Because in the end, it isn't the land or the cattle that matters. It's the lives we're willing to guard, even at the edge of our own.